He laughed. Clean, effortless, the kind of laugh that had bought him boardrooms in 3 continents. The chandeliers caught the sound and threw it back like a spotlight. Outside, the city roared under a thin winter sky. Inside, the air smelled of imported coffee and confidence. They had come to sign a plan that would change the skyline. A cluster of towers, a logistics hub, an investment everyone in that room expected to be remembered for. Vinicius adjusted his cufflink, smiled for the cameras, and laughed at the boy who had wandered into the meeting as if he belonged. The boy's clothes were patched. His hands still had the faint gray of dirt from the morning's work. He held a notebook, edges frayed, pages refolded into a careful order. He had walked past security without anyone seeing him, past polished secretaries and the glint of gold pens, and stood at the edge of the long table. He did not look like anyone who should be there. He looked like someone who had always had to make do. "Who let this kid in?" someone said, the question more of a ripple than a reprimand. Vinicius laughed again. It was quick, dismissive, a final punctuation before they moved on. "This is absurd," he said. "He must be lost." The boy did not blink. He set the notebook on the table, and with a small, steady voice that cut through the murmur, he said, "Sir, you miscalculated the land. You treated 2 plots as one." Short sentence, clear fact. The room laughed a second time, softer now, embarrassed laughter that tried to be polite. Then the room went silent. If you picture it, the glass city behind them, the stretch of skyline like a promise, and a single small hand pointing at a line on a page. The line rearranged everything. In that silence, the numbers in the boy's notebook suddenly had weight. A visiting investor, Mr. Robert, an American with an exacting stare, leaned forward. He smelled the coffee and frowned. He took the notebook in both hands and compared a smudged ink number with the architect's printout. He checked a deed scanned on his tablet, then checked again. The calculations didn't add up. 2 parcels, not 1. Dimensions wrong. The plan assumed a contiguous site. It wasn't. The consequence of that one oversight was brutal on paper. A potential loss ranging in the hundreds of millions, clauses to be triggered, insurers to call, headlines to write. They had gone from a triumphant signing to a business emergency in less time than it takes to finish a cup of coffee. In 2 minutes, their whole world changed. Boardroom confidence thinned into frightened curiosity. Phones lit up. Legal counsel stepped into corners and spoke in clipped tones. Contracts that had been ready to be signed were pulled back across the table like nets. An investor quietly closed his laptop. The term reputational risk began to appear in sentences that had, an hour ago, contained only optimism. Vinicius felt it in his stomach first, a sudden, vertiginous slipping under his feet. He had built an empire on decisions made in rooms like this one. He had been the man who signed checks and hired men who signed reports. And now an uninvited boy, one who scrubbed bottles and listened to lectures on a public bench, had him by a single wrong decimal. When the laughter had been easy, it allowed others to relax into the hierarchy. When the silence came, it revealed a fragile system. The very people who applauded his courage in business now watched him for the move that would save or break them all. He could already hear the headlines in his head, the story that his rivals would make if he failed. The boy slid a corner of the notebook toward Mr. Robert. "The deed is split," he said. "I counted the stumps when I walked the line. There's a boundary marker hidden under the heap of tires there. It changes the area by—" He tapped a page. "By 20%. "You counted the stumps?" someone whispered, incredulous and oddly admiring. Donna Conceição, the building's longtime cleaning woman who had known the boy since he arrived months ago, had quietly followed him into the conference area and stood by the doorway. She had always said he kept that book as if it were gold. Now she watched, hands folded over a worn broom, the one person in the room who had a right to look at him without surprise. "He's not a thief," she said, voice small but clear. "He's a worker. He learns." Mr. Robert did what the rest of the room could not. He called the site manager. A minute later, the manager, breathing hard and smelling faintly of diesel, arrived with scanned deeds in hand. He compared them, then checked the municipal registry. Faces around the table drained of color as the mistake was confirmed. In that tense, humming second, contracts were put on hold. Partners called their counsels. One banker in the next chair closed his briefcase like a judge dropping a gavel. "You don't belong here," someone had said earlier as a joke. Now nobody laughed. Vinicius sat very still, feeling the weight of the eyes that had once admired him tilt toward accusation. He heard, underneath everything, the soft voice of the boy again. "Sir, you missed a line here." He could have doubled down. He could have blamed a junior associate, the architect, the scanner. He could have made the boy vanish with security's polite hands and issued a statement about procedural errors. Pride would have been easy then. Pride would have kept his image intact, if only for a while. But what happens when pride confronts a ledger where the numbers do not lie? What happens when the ledger is held by a child with a torn notebook and more courage than privilege? Vinicius stood. The room expected a defense, a dismissal. Instead, he walked around the table and looked, really looked, at the boy whose fingers left ink on everything they touched. He put a hand on the notebook as if to steady it and said quietly, in a voice that surprised even himself, "I am sorry. You were right." There was a small sound then, like something giving way. Some chairs scraped backward. A woman dabbed at her forehead. Apologies are light as breath, heavy as consequence. They don't erase the risk, but they change the shape of what follows. For Vinicius, that apology was the hinge. After the meeting, investors did not all stay. Some moved faster than papers could be stamped. A few withdrew conditional support while audits were scheduled. The company's stock dipped, headlines spun, and overnight reputations became fragile. For a moment, brief, blinding, the voice that had commanded boardrooms felt the ground shudder. He had almost lost everything. Not every asset, not his life's work in its totality, but the fragile confidence of partners, the open doors he'd expected to lead to global deals. The world, for him, had narrowed to the size of a single ledger. The humiliation of having laughed at someone who turned out to be right burned. But humiliation coexisted with another feeling, an oddly fierce gratitude. The boy had shown up one small truth that kept the company afloat. In a different room, under a different sky, that truth would have been swallowed by hubris. Here, it had been spoken and heard. Vinicius did not make grand promises in the days that followed. He made practical decisions. He called the boy back to a neutral room and listened while the boy explained his method. He listened when the boy said, "My mother says God sees the heart." The line was personal, not proselytizing, the kind of sentence that reveals a person's anchor in the world. Vinicius could have been moved and empty. Instead, he asked a question he hadn't asked in years. "How did you learn this?" "On the streets," the boy answered. "I watched trucks. I counted steps. I drew maps for days. I read when I could. I taught myself when no one was teaching." There is a particular kind of intelligence that doesn't bloom in classrooms, but in need. The boy, Matthias, had honed spatial awareness by necessity, learned basic surveying from watching workers, and had filled pages with a shorthand of his own. That notebook was not an accident. It was the product of curiosity and survival. Vinicius offered immediate help, a place to sleep that night, a bag of clothes, a call to the municipal shelter to verify records. But he also did something more deliberate. He offered Matthias a scholarship to a technical institute and a junior position on the project team, not as token charity, but as an acknowledgement that talent often shows up in the most unexpected envelopes. He asked Dona Conceição to join an outreach team, and later, when she proved formidable at communicating between contractors and community members, he promoted her to community liaison. He appointed Dona Maria, Matthias's mother, who had been an unofficial leader among the shelter's residents, to help coordinate housing transition for families who had been overlooked. Some in the company grumbled. "Why him?" they asked. Others were skeptical of the optics, a boy from the streets in a room of suits. But there were also engineers who looked at the notebook and felt a spark of possibility. The initial program they launched, quiet at first, because they lacked the arrogance to call it philanthropy, was called Genio Invisível. It was a scouting and training initiative. Find uncredentialed talent working in informal sectors, laborers, recyclers, apprentices, teach them formal skills, give them mentorship, and integrate promising candidates into live projects under supervision. The project was pragmatic, designed to reduce future oversights and to tap into perspectives that typical schooling might miss. Early wins were not cinematic. They were spreadsheets and timelines, a consistent trimming of waste and better land use planning. Matthias's eye for boundaries saved the company from a costly reconfiguration. A young woman from a carpentry cooperative they'd partnered with proposed a modular solution that cut construction time by weeks. A former metalworker redesigned a crane attachment that simplified logistics and reduced maintenance costs. These improvements did not make the company rich overnight, nor did they promise a utopia where help equals instant success. They did, however, create measurable savings, money that had been leaking into inefficiency, and they created something less calculable, a culture that started to ask who else might be out there, unregistered and unseen, carrying solutions in their hands. The change attracted attention. Journalists who once followed Vinicius for his glamorous purchases now wrote about his awkward but real experiment in inclusion. Investors who had pulled back were cautiously interested again when the numbers stabilized, and a new line of community-based projects showed both social value and improved margins. Not everyone came back. Some partners left, not because they lacked compassion, but because their mandates were narrower. Losing those partners was part of the price. It felt for a time like losing everything, because what they had lost was certainty and the easy rhythm of applause. But losing certainty opened space for something harder and truer. A year later, the company was up for an international tender in Dubai, a sustainable housing solution for a disaster-prone region. Competitors included vast conglomerates with glossy proposals and smooth pitches. The Brazilian team, now led in part by Mateus and a handful of Genio Invisível graduates, submitted an entry forged from field-tested pragmatism, modular units that used reclaimed materials, designs that accounted for local informal behaviors, logistical plans built by those who had worked with little more than rope and ingenuity. The presentation in Dubai was humble. It began with a worn notebook placed on the podium. On stage, under lights that once would have been used to applaud Vinicius alone, Mateus spoke. He did not posture. He explained instead, plainly, "We make things that last because they are built by people who know what it is to fix, to adapt, to live with little and care for much." When the award was announced, the hall rose in applause. Cameras found Vinicius in the front row, his hands folded, near tears. That image, of the billionaire who had laughed, then learned, then risked embarrassment again by standing beside those he had once dismissed, circulated across feeds and newspapers. At the ceremony, in a moment small enough that only a few cameras recorded it, Vinicius stepped off the stage. He walked to Mateus, took the notebook into his own hands and said, "You taught me what my ledgers could not. Thank you." Mateus smiled, and for a quarter second, the city's bright lights did not seem so much like trophies as they did evidence of possibility. In that exchange, there was no theatrical salvation, no promise that every life would be fixed with a handshake. There was, instead, an honest recognition of dependence. The wealthy depended on humility, institutions depended on listening. Back home, the program expanded. They started a small cooperative university, less ivory tower, more workshop, where practical skills met basic formal training. Donna Maria, who'd become program coordinator, introduced a policy that prioritized hiring from neighborhoods affected by urban development. The company instituted verification protocols that required community consultations before paperwork was final. Contracts were retooled so that a local stakeholder review was mandatory. These were structural shifts, slow and steady, meant to prevent the kind of oversight that had once nearly cost them fortunes. Vinicius did not instantly become virtuous. He kept his suits and his houses. He still enjoyed the pleasures he had earned. But his laughter changed. It carried a humility that was not performative. He learned to carry mistakes not like scars to display, but like lessons to correct. Losing everything fast had not meant the extinguishing of his fortune. It had meant watching investors pull back, seeing contracts freeze, feeling the social mirror crack. That collapse, temporary and terrifying, was the pressure that forced a different kind of metamorphosis. The moment of near loss woke him from complacency. Matthias kept his notebook. He filled new pages with plans drawn on trains and at site visits, his handwriting growing steadier with practice. He graduated from the Technical Institute and later taught a course there, a small room where he taught the art of reading the land with eyes that had learned to see beyond official maps. He never became a symbol. He remained a man who had always had to make choices and who now had more options. He married a woman he had met in an urban garden project and once joked at a dinner that he still counted stumps sometimes, because looking at the edges of things reminded him how much else was hidden from view. What changed in the city was not a miracle. It was a series of decisions. A man admitted he was wrong. A company created pathways where none existed. A mother became a coordinator, and a cleaner became a liaison. People did not rise because someone waved a magic wand. They rose because systems shifted to let them in. So what do we take from this? That talent does not come with a tidy resume. That arrogance can blind even the best trained eyes. that a small notebook, a steady hand, and a refusal to be invisible can reroute the course of a corporation. And perhaps most urgently, that losing everything fast, whether it is reputation, contracts, or certainty, can be the very thing that forces a change worth keeping. If this moved you, subscribe. If you like stories that change the way you see people, stay with us. The story ends not with a pedestal but with a workbench. The university they started was small but stubborn. The Genio Invisible program continued to find people whose genius had been overlooked. The company that almost fell rebuilt itself more carefully, with checks that began in neighborhoods and not just in executive summaries. Vinicius returned to boardrooms with fewer illusions and more questions. Mateus returned to the places he came from with a team that opened doors but did not pretend to have all the answers. And finally, if this story spoke to you, share it with someone who needs to hear that talent can live where we least expect it, and tell us where you're watching from.